attrition. We think of trenches, we think of, obviously kind of two sides facing each other under terrible sort of circumstances. But of course, the first part of the war is altogether different. So this photo seems really kind of incongruous. What we're seeing here is obviously kind of the Germans sweeping through Belgium in kind of 1914. There's no mud in sight. And the first months of the war, which broke out in August 1914, were kind of incredibly mobile, with the Germans pushing through Belgium and advancing up to 120 kilometres into France in just a kind of matter of days. And I'll just bring you up an advance of that, but I now know. So hopefully you'll still be able to hear me as you can look at this map. So the British forces brought into the war to defend Belgian neutrality kind of experienced the opposite. So obviously as the Germans push forward, if you look at obviously those kind of green arrows, you can see gradually pushing across from Belgium into France. And so this period is what's known as the Battle of the Frontiers. And starting at Mons in Belgium on the 23rd of August, the British Expeditionary Force went into retreat, and 3 days later faced defeat again, some 40 kilometres south at a place called Le Cateau. So let me just bring up the image of the retreat. We'll just add, what I found I need to do is add the input as we go along. So hopefully you'll be able to see here. So as you can see, I want you to contrast here. So we've got the Germans obviously working westwards, haven't we? You can see obviously the German border coming through Belgium, and going towards the kind of front line, pushing towards Paris with those kind of swooping arrows. If you now compare this in contrast with the British positions, we've now got a series of kind of stops. So the British kind of starting at Mons are trying to hold back the Germans. Obviously they're trying to hold them back from kind of attacking and taking Paris. But also it's kind of about as far as kind of possible, trying to stop the Germans in their tracks and to kind of halt this kind of forward momentum. So the generals plan to take us out at Saint Quentin, and if you look at what about kind of 2/3 of the way down, slightly towards the left, you'll see this the town of Saint Quentin, city of Saint Quentin, and the generals are going to plan to take a stand here. Now, Saint Quentin at that time was deep behind the French and British lines. A casualty clearing station had just been set up days earlier on the 21st of August. On the 25th of August, the British forces withdrew from Le Cateau. So if you kind of draw a line upwards and slightly to the right, you'll see Le Cateau. So on the night of the 26th of August 1914, the Allies began their withdrawal from Le Cateau to Saint Quentin. And the French Fifth Army under General Charles Lanzarac was tasked with holding off the German advance while the British Expeditionary Force retreated to the left flank, so the left-hand side but towards Vermand there. Now, ahead of the main force, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment retreated to Saint Quentin on the afternoon of the 26th of August 1914, where it became mixed up with the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. Now, the men were exhausted and hungry, and Elkington, who their commander-in-chief, was disappointed to find there was no onward transport in the town, so there was no plan for where they were going to go next. The Dublin's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Mainwaring, had entered into a written agreement with the town's mayor, the town of Saint Quentin, to surrender rather than fight in the streets, though Elkington stated later he didn't see the agreement. Now, following day, a cavalry major arrived in the town, a British one, and by threats and encouragement succeeded in marching the men and other stragglers out of the town and away from the German forces. So in other words, they turned tail and ran. They were ordered to stand their guard at Saint Quentin, here and kind of no further, but unfortunately the forces turned away. Now I've got a picture for you of Elkington. I'll just bring up my microphone so that we get that as well. And move across. So 2 weeks after the incident, Elkington, who, as I say, was the officer in charge, was charged with cowardice at court-martial. And though he was cleared of the main charge, he was convicted of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. And with Mainwaring, he was cashiered and was thrown out of the army. So Elkington applied to rejoin the army as a private, right at the bottom, but he's refused, and so instead he travelled to Paris to join the French Foreign Legion. And in late spring of 1915, he fought at the Second Battle of Artois and received the Cross de Guerre, the French military cross, for bravery in rescuing a detachment of his unit. Elkington was wounded in the leg by machine gun fire while leading the assault on a further battle in September of 1915, and he spent the next 10 months in hospital. But he received a palm to his Croix de Guerre and was awarded the French military medal on the orders of General Joseph Joffre. So news of this had reached the British press. In September 1916, he returned to a hero's welcome. Elkington was reinstated to his previous rank in the army and appointed the Distinguished Service Order by George V. So again, it's just a nice little interesting story, kind of a great mix-up, but something that happened that's kind of central to the progress of the war in the town square in Saint Quentin. And interestingly, one of the junior officers that day of Elkington was a chap called Bernard Montgomery, who I'm sure many of you will be aware of. Kind of Monty went on to lead the British forces during the D-Day campaigns, obviously El Alamein and the Desert Rats. Kind of before that was a junior officer to Elkington, and actually after Elkington died, Montgomery basically led his kind of tributes and fundraised because he felt he'd been treated very shabbily. But back to Saint Quentin. So the British force have deserted, leaving the French now are the only soldiers that are in town. And on August 29th, the French Fifth Army launched a counter-attack against the German positions in Saint Quentin. However, the Germans, having intercepted French orders, so basically the Germans knew what the French were going to do, were well prepared, and the French forces faced heavy casualties and limited success. So the German Second Army managed to regroup and counter the French attacks effectively. And despite some advances by the French on the right flank, the overall German strategy forced the French to retreat, and they experienced some very heavy losses. They withdrew from Saint Quentin, but not without experiencing 10,000 casualties, and Saint Quentin will be behind German lines for the rest of the war. So I'm going to play the first part of a video now for you, captured in Saint Quentin, and this is the French military cemetery. And I want you to notice that this section of the video is about 1914 casualties. So it's about the loss of life. So you got 853 Icono, so soldiers they couldn't kind of recognise, don't know who the bodies were, in ossuaries. If you look at these dates here, the 29th and the 28th of August 1914, this is the Battle of Saint Quentin. The British had kind of upped and left, as you might say. The French are left to try and defend the place, and they're caught on the hop because it's a mobile thing. And so we see ossuaries, big burial pits. There's no time for proper war graves. What you're going to see in a minute on the left-hand side and the right-hand side are huge burial pits. And bearing in mind, within a day after these deaths had happened, this is under German control, then consequently, the Germans weren't about to kind of disinter and bury these. So consequently, what you've got for this first part of the Saint Quentin cemetery is basically two huge body pits containing all these kind of French soldiers that can remain there until obviously the end of the war, when the French were able to take over. So it is ossuary number B and ossuary A. So it's kind of sad to sort of see these because they don't really get, obviously as you look out the 1918 graves we'll come back and talk about a little bit later on the tour, they don't get the same markers. But unfortunately it's because at this stage the war is so mobile, and this is literally in the last days and hours of Saint Quentin being kind of part of the French territory. It's about to fall into kind of German hands, and so as a result of that, you've got then the French soldiers in kind of mass kind of burial pits. So very sad, very sad. So that's kind of Saint Quentin 1914. It's kind of been the point where hopefully it was going to be the stand, enough no more, but unfortunately we've got a bungled British surrender. Then the British kind of hightailed out of there, and the French were left to carry the can, and horrendous death and casualties, as you saw. So during the last kind of mobile phase, I'll bring up another kind of image for you. hopefully we've got that. Hopefully you'll be able to still see me, hear me. So during the kind of last mobile phase, you'll kind of see the dotted arrow here. You'll see limit of German advance September 1914. This is kind of how far Saint Quentin, unfortunately, is now. We're kind of behind these German lines. Up to the kind of first Battle of the Marne. So during this kind of last phase of the war, which becomes the sort of focus of the Western Front for the next 3 years, the Germans focus on building a formidable Hindenburg line, which is the kind of solid purple line here, a stretch of which runs through Saint Quentin, using the Canal Tunnel as a defensive fortification. So Saint Quentin was still in German hands when the withdrawal of Russia from the war in March 1918, obviously following the Russian Revolution, released substantial numbers of German troops for use elsewhere. So aware that submarine, get my teeth in, as in the U-boats, warfare had failed to defeat Britain, and that a large number of American troops would soon be committed to the war, the Germans prepared for their final offensive in the west. So we're now going to talk about Saint Quentin and kind of 1918, and it's all about a couple of guys who hopefully I can find a picture of. Doesn't look like I've got one to hand here. Which is, just bear with me, we'll just bring up an image and hopefully we'll get those for you. This is about General Ludendorff, and the plan basically to achieve a kind of final victory in the kind of struggle, really, to try and kind of push back the British and the kind of French forces, but to achieve something of a victory. And as we're about to see, they never really kind of managed to get. Let me just find a photo for you that I saved earlier but forgot to upload. So apologies for that. Here we go. So, okay, I found that for you. So let's move that across. So here we have then an image of Hindenburg, as in the Hindenburg line, Ludendorff, and in the middle we have the Kaiser. So Kaiser Wilhelm is in the centre, and he's studying operational maps there with Hindenburg on the left and Ludendorff on the right. So Hindenburg is the chief of German general staff, has been since August 16 during the Somme, and he kind of shapes German military policy for the rest of the war with Ludendorff, who's the quartermaster general. And Hindenburg's kind of popular kind of head of state, if you like, but really Ludendorff is the guy. Now, the United States entered the war on April the 6th, 1917, but they weren't going to arrive until 1918. And they kind of fell under British and French command. So the idea was that the Germans want to kind of strike before really the Americans could become established and can tip over. Now, Field Marshal Haig's British divisions were under strength in infantry, and so when the Germans launched their attack in March of 1918, they found themselves undergunned. The government was unwilling to send more troops to the Western Front, so Haig was forced to reduce the number of infantry battalions in his division, but also kind of move troops. So we've now got the beginnings of kind of British troops on the move. As we go, we should be back. Okay, sorry. Yep, yeah, I hadn't twigged. Yep, it's a pesky situation filling, but you should be right. So the previous picture you were seeing the British soldiers kind of moving up the line. You've now got the Germans about to do the attack in March of 19. These are kind of German stormtroopers. And you've got a relatively short but intense hurricane bombardments are targeted on the British artillery and machine gun positions, their HQs, their telephone exchanges, railways and communication centres, and then heavily armed German stormtroops as kind of assault weak points in the line, bypassing pockets of Allied resistance and breaking through their trench system, leaving waves of troops to mop any defenders. So there's a kind of interesting picture that I'll kind of bring up for you now that was done by a, and I'm going to make sure that I've got the audio on there before we go across, that was done by a British officer that hopefully you should be able to see this okay. Kind of showing, if you like, the British lines before, and then these kind of penetrations of these small numbers of kind of German advance parties. They're kind of breaking through, so they were like, it was all about penetrating, infiltrating the weak points on the line. And it was very successful. And by the evening of the 23rd of March, the Germans advanced up to 12 miles in some sectors. So the German advance of spring of 1918 really is all in. It is kind of the last opportunity really to break through and achieve a kind of decisive punch, if you like, into the Allied lines. And so, again, just going back to our kind of maps here, you can now see this dotted line is punching forward. So not at all dissimilar to 1914. You've got the Germans kind of pushing back, punching through the lines. And you've got the German army represented by green boxers. They first attack on the Somme, effectively destroying the British Fifth Army, driving a wedge between the British, who were the red boxers, and the French in the blue. And you'll see a New Zealand division have to come down, rush south to kind of support in late March to establish a kind of new defensive line. And they stopped the New Zealanders at Colincourt and Auchinvillers. They managed to stop the German advance at Amiens, which was really important as a rail hub that connected British armies to kind of Flanders and the rest of France at Amiens, right in the kind of centre. So it's kind of really dodgy sort of period. In this kind of series of battles, the Germans advanced up to 60 kilometres into Allied-held territory, extending the front line from the solid purple to the line of kind of dashes you've got there in the centre of the map. And in rushing forces south, the British had left Flanders region around Ypres and the Channel points kind of vulnerable. And in April, the Germans attacked up there and halted up at Hauserbruck, which you can just see just under the number 2 there. So a lot of this I know is kind of detail and maps. And so, hopefully kind of taking this in, because it's about this kind of, you've got this static period, but either side you've got this kind of mobility, as each side is trying to lay out a kind of punch, a knockout punch. So this is the kind of Germans trying to do this. So they capture a substantial amount of territory during the spring offensive, the Germans, but it's of little strategic value to them. And then they're kind of depleted and overextended. And of course, once you move your troops forward, you've then got the challenge of supplying those troops. So your supply lines get broken down. And of course, what are they doing is they're coming across onto, the areas that is now the mud baths, and the areas that have been kind of destroyed, the no man's land. So it's not at all easy for them to kind of supply the troops. So all early success belies a kind of core weakness of the plan, which is the Germans are too exhausted to sustain the offensive. They lack the transport to convert local tactical triumphs into strategic victory, and they struggle to move men, supplies and guns across the shattered landscape of the Western Front. But in the first few days, it really does spread kind of panic across the Allied front, because it looked like the Germans might achieve a stunning victory. And so many called behind the enemy lines, absolutely. So we've got now some pictures of the British movement. So again, I'll just make sure I'm adding volume onto this before I move across. I've now learned my lesson, and hopefully this is now working somewhat better. We're going to go back to some video in just a minute, but just a few more pictures just to show you. So again, we've got movement now, as you see here, of a British artillery column. So guns which have been kind of dug in for 3 years are suddenly moving up to the line for the Battle of Saint Quentin. So again, between the 21st and the 23rd of March 1918. the Germans attack Saint Quentin, or rather kind of push on from Saint Quentin, and this is the British moving their forces up there. On the 26th of March, in exchange for reinforcements, Haig agreed to the appointment of France's Marshal Foch as the supreme commander on the Western Front. So the British are so desperate that Haig is prepared to kind of General Haig, who of course is associated with disasters of the Somme and Passchendaele and so forth, is prepared to take number 2 job because he thinks this is now it's going so badly, which is kind of interesting. We've got another picture just to share with you of the Germans, the British troops trying to move up the line, desperately trying to throw bodies into the way to halt this German advance. So we've got British troops from the Middlesex Regiment coming up. So lots of photos here. The tanks, they've been introduced in Cambrai in 1917, but the tanks were very, very vulnerable to German kind of artillery. So once again, Saint Quentin is the kind of the centre of where everything is beginning to happen. And so although the Germans advanced as much as 40 miles by the 5th of April, their advance begins to run out of steam and they're held to the east of Amiens. But on the 11th of April 1918, Field Marshal Haig issues what becomes a notorious special order of the day that is read out to all the troops. And he says, "There is no other course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. The safety of our homes and freedom of mankind alike depend on the conduct of each and every one of us at this critical moment." So basically the troops were told there's no surrender, you've got to hold the Germans back, and if you can't, you've got to die trying. So in effect they were given something of a kind of suicide pass. So the Germans had enjoyed great success during the start of the operation, but by July their offensive was running out of steam and the defensive countermeasures taken by the Allies had taken a heavy toll on their forces. So we begin to get the fight back, and I'm just going to bring up for you now the map of, this is where the Americans, so if there are any Americans watching, I know Linda and 1 or 2 others are there, this is where you guys really begin to step up and into battle. Better late than never. But here you can see now the at the top in Flanders, obviously Belgium, French, British forces. Further down at Loos and Vimy, the British and Canadian, and then we've got the Americans in the midst of the Somme. So on the 28th of May 1918, the US 1st Division under French command executed the 1st Division size offensive, seizing Contenay and holding it against German counterattacks. Between July the 22nd and August 22nd, under British command, elements of the American 33rd and 80th Divisions participated in the reduction of the Amiens salient. So we're going to go out to some videos now. I'm going to show you 2 videos that I shot that will hopefully show you. Hang on a minute, but let's just go past. So we've seen that, so let's go on to the video. We'll just bring that up. So we'll just move that along a little bit. So like so, that should. Right, here we go. So we're coming to now show you the American Memorial on the Somme. It was deserted when I visited there back in July. So I'm sure that many of you won't visit. So let's talk about the American Battle of Saint Quentin in September. So on September the 24th, having fought previously with the British in Belgium, the American 27th and 30th Divisions were placed in front of the Hindenburg Line. The Saint Quentin Canal Tunnel, nearly 4 miles long, was the backbone of this defensive line. Hundreds of tunnels connected the canal to various German defensive positions, and we're now walking above the top of the canal. The monument to the Americans on the Somme is at the mouth of where the canal was. So the Battle of Saint Quentin Canal was a pivotal offensive carried out by British, Australian and United States forces during the First World War's 100 Days Offensive. The offensive goal was to capture and cross the Saint Quentin Canal, which wound its way through the battlefields of northern France at the time of the Great War. For the American Imperial German defenders facing the arrayed Allied troops, the canal formed a ready-made section of the Hindenburg line defence. The Hindenburg is basically the dug-in concrete and barbed wire. The Germans had literally had 3 years to build. So when the wall becomes static, the Germans dig in with concrete, with barbed wire, and so by the time they come to the 1918 attacks, they are attacking incredibly heavy fortified. So, we've got to bear this in mind, that these young American inexperienced troops were kind of facing, a very deeply dug-in German army that had been there for 3 years. So the action at Saint Quentin was fought by a multinational force, British, Australian and American units. So this is run by the American Battlefields Trust. And they were organised as part of the British Fourth Army, commanded by General Sir Henry Rawlinson, although it was Australian Lieutenant General Sir John Monash who took command of the operations on the ground. And around 32 Allied divisions, including 30 from the British Empire and 2 American divisions, the 27th and the 30th, were assembled to assault Saint Quentin. And essentially that's over 500,000 men from all around the world came together in this force at this place in September of 1918, just outside Saint Quentin. Here we are. So you can see here, this was erected, just so you can read it, by the United States to commemorate this. So this is the American Memorial on the Somme. And of course, the Americans, just to make you aware, weren't around with the main battles associated with the Somme, which is obviously July the 1st through October of 1916. The American forces didn't enter into the war until 1917. So consequently, there aren't really many American battlegrounds on the Somme. We've got British, we've got Canadian, we've got New Zealand, we've got Australian, we've got South African, but there isn't really much by way of American presence on the Somme. However, there is this monument and the cemetery that I'm going to show you as well from kind of 1918. So General Monash, who was the Australian leader who was in charge of basically trying to punch through the German lines at Saint Quentin, was initially aghast that the Australian force would be in the forefront yet again at Saint Quentin, because they've been fighting basically all the way through August and through September. It's a really beautiful memorial, don't you think? So you've got obviously the American sort of symbols there. The eagle and so forth. These are kind of the battle size of the eagle at the top there. So on the 27th of August, the Americans led the assault. So Monash had basically orchestrated it so that the Australian force could be in the background and the American forces could go up to be kind of front and centre. And this, he believed that he was doing the right thing, but to give his own soldiers a rest. But what it did mean, of course, is it put some very, very inexperienced American troops in the front line against this pillbox set up. So we've got the monument here to the, as you can see, the 30th, 31st, 6th Engineers and the 27th Divisions of the Americans at Bellicourt. So on the 27th of September, an American-led assault on 3 German strongpoints was launched, and it was not a success. The inexperienced but enthusiastic US troops were without adequate command, and only 18 officers were available across 12 companies due to others being trained elsewhere. So consequently, you see here the map on the... It's a fascinating cemetery. So you got a map, goes 6 days, you'll sort of see again lines moving of basically how the battle moved. So as I say, after sort of 3 years of it being static, you've got this movement, but of course with movement you can actually get then a lot more killing. So you've got the 27th Division at the top, the 30th Division at the bottom, and because they're moving, they're not entrenched, you've got a lot more exposure, of course, to the German machine guns. On the 29th, 2 days later, the main assault was launched, and thick foggy conditions helped the 30th Division to reach the southern entrance of the tunnel, which of course was the point. And the 27th Division faced a determined German defence near Boney, which is where we are now on this video. In the early hours of the 29th, German guns let fly huge British artillery bombardment in this area. And in short order, 1,600 guns fired close on 1 million shells, battering the German forward positions. And new fuses for the high explosive shells hurled at opposition lines, cleared great swathes of barbed wire, clearing the way in several important areas. I love this, by the way. This is like a kind of compass. But despite this, the creeping barrage that was customary for support infantry attacks was missing for the American 27th position, leaving the men very vulnerable to the assaults and to machine guns. Their goal was to capture a position known as the Catalay-Nord, which is about to come up, I think, into the video site. And after the Americans had taken this, the Australian 3rd and 5th Divisions would then leapfrog the counterparts and push on further and break American defences near Bellicourt. But the American attack did not go well. The 27th Division attacked without its protective barrage, ended up on a scattered, leaderless bands, and the literal fog of war descended on this part of the battlefield too, further confusing the American assault, leaving them vulnerable to machine gun fire. And for its 107th Infantry Regiment, this was the bloodiest day of any American regiment in World War One. Rather than coming to kind of relieve then and leapfrog the US comrades, the Australian 3rd and 5th Divisions were deployed to bring the attack to a successful conclusion. This infuriated kind of Monash, because basically his forces were exhausted, but he had to go and help out the Americans. It took another 4 days of close fighting before Australians and Americans would capture Le Catelet. And despite this, the Americans did kind of fight well, but of course they took extreme losses. We'll talk about the battle in a minute, but we've moved now, again, beautiful sunshine. This is the American military cemetery. It's about 3 kilometres, I believe, in a place called Bellicourt now, from Boney. So that was where you just saw the memorial. That was where basically the focal point, do you know what I mean, of the attack went. This was obviously behind the lines. This is now where the Americans are buried. Very beautiful cemetery. Very moving, of course, and the first time I've shown you an American cemetery, because there aren't many on the site. So the Battle of Saint Quentin was an overwhelming Allied success. The capture of such an important location provided a huge advantage, but of course at enormous cost. Imperial Germany had lost another defence line, and by the 2nd of October, British and Australian soldiers pushing on from Saint Quentin had punched a hole straight through the formidable Hindenburg line. But let's just take a minute to watch this video. I'll give a bit of commentary. Let me just sip my tea. Isn't it magnificent against that kind of blue sky? And again, what immediately kind of strikes you, of course, encountering the military cemeteries is the precision both of the burial, so you get these unbelievable kind of sightlines. The American monuments, we've got the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. This is the American equivalent that look after the cemeteries on behalf of the American people. And to be honest, you don't get many visitors, as you probably know, and kind of with Private Ryan, and probably, you know, the fact it's kind of more front and centre in the American imagination. You get far more American visitors visit the war graves in Normandy rather than in Picardy. So consequently, you go to these places and they're kind of largely deserted. Whereas if you went to the kind of the beaches in and around kind of the Saving Private Ryan, you'd find a lot of people. But consequently, this graveyard is deserted. It's a wonderful cemetery run by the superintendent, an American guy that I met, Steve. This is the names of the 333 missing inside this wonderful sort of a temple, I suppose you want to call it. There's really an equivalent of these at the kind of British cemeteries. But you'll see again, it's all kind of 1918, May, September, May, June, and a lot of privates. Again, it's people kind of right at the bottom of the line, and of course, many of them would have been kind of encouraged, constricted, kind of pushed into a cook dying there, failing to kind of get out of the way. Probably a shell landed on the kind of food station. So we've got people. There was nobody here apart from myself and Mrs. John on that day. You'll see as we kind of go and walk around. People from all over the States are kind of buried here, but all of whom died. You see the sort of the states there, but mostly you got a bugler there, as you can see. Most of them all dying within a very short period of time, and this is the assault on the very heavily fortified German trenches. So this was really the first sort of serious action that the American forces saw, and of course what it did mean is kind of them telegrams started going back. The Jewish, you can see some Jewish graves. Is for a war that up until 1916 had been very far away, and don't forget until Woodrow Wilson came in, the Americans were completely felt this was a European war, nothing to do with them. You've then got the sinking of the Lusitania, and then the first of what's known as the kind of propaganda is launched that basically Woodrow Wilson persuades the American populations in their interest. And so by 1917 the Americans enter the war. It's obviously training, and so they don't actually arrive until the spring of 1918 as a fighting force, and they're thrown straight into the battles against this German army that's kind of been dug in for 3 years with cement, concrete, machine guns, artillery, and young American boys were forced to put their bodies, their flesh in the way, and that's what the sacrifice of September and October of 1918, just before the end of the war, looks like. So, like the British cemeteries, immaculately maintained. The cleanliness, there's no weeds, there is no detritus, there's no litter. The when you have the famous poem "They Shall Not Grow Old," it's not just talking about the soldiers' memories, it's talking about the graves that could have been planted yesterday. This Portland stone helps. But what it does do, of course, is it gives a sense that despite this, obviously you see Joseph Lee Pierce here, North Carolina, died in July of 1918. And Gus Cannon, October 1918 from Montana. The graves look like they could have been put in, last year. North Carolina, September 1918, William Poole. So I always try and give a few names. You can't do them all, of course. William Pullen from New York, September 29th, 1918. This is all the Battle of Saint Quentin Canal. Alpheus Stewart from Texas, as we can see. But as Linda says, there's nobody that was here apart from us that day. That guy that you saw walk past, a member of staff, groundsman. But there's something very beautiful, very kind of timely, of course. They do resemble parade grounds. There's something like flying in formation. I don't know how I feel about the American kind of crosses, because we're used to kind of the British oval stones, which carry a lot more information. But the British, the Americans, the French, and the Germans all decided that they wanted crosses. So far less information. So there's less information about soldiers. And it doesn't tell you which unit they were fighting for. You see a Jewish Star of David there, so there are a number of Jewish kind of graves. You might have seen there the tablet inside the tabernacle there, reflecting the kind of Jewish kind of losses. Got the stars and stripes flying up at the top. It really is a beautiful place, and as I say, it just knocks you out. The sheer respect that is shown to these war dead is I think kind of second to none. More Jewish graves coming up on the left of your picture, as you can kind of see there. So service personnel. So David Wall, who died again September the 29th, 1918. Battle of Saint Quentin Canal. From New York, Isaac Solomanoff. So these dates, hopefully, they're Jerome Schwartz, same day. I don't know if these dates are part. You must tell me, Linda's on. Is it part of the American psyche? Do you know about the 29th of September 1918? Because it was a bloodbath for you guys. I know you know all about the Second War. At times I find it kind of fascinating that it doesn't extend to the First War, which was awful. Obviously the death toll far less for Americans, because this wasn't the same amount of personnel involved. But I think it should be part of that national kind of memory. Polly, I know, is Canadian. There's obviously huge amounts of Canadian memorials. We'll do that kind of next time we're over there. We'll go back and do some Canadian stuff. But I think it's particularly beautiful. The thing that saddens me, and it's going to be the same, like you're going to see in a minute, some more cemetery footage, is there's no markers. The nice thing about the British cemeteries that are all over the Somme is you go there and you will see there's poppies, there's flowers, there's photographs. There isn't any in the American cemetery. So we're going back to the French. I want to show you that's where we started now. You now see the reality for the French. So we've got now the immediate graves, the first graves. You see there, got Germans now in Saint Quentin. It was occupied. We've got the destruction of the cathedral. I showed you the cathedral on my first tour. We've got German troops there marching through the centre of Saint Quentin. Saint Quentin, which is where I've now got a house, was behind the German lines. It was a German city. So if you look above this shop here, you'll see a new sign. Look, Lager de Commandateur. It was under German hands. So it's really strange to be kind of back behind the kind of the German lines. So of course this French cemetery wasn't done at the time. Wasn't done during the war, because this was, we've seen the first part of this, the ossuaries at the back. These are now the 1918s. So as we know, the French armies were also attacking on Saint Quentin Canal and suffered pretty horrendous losses. So, but again, what saddens me, and obviously it's very dry here, I think this was July I filmed this, is you just don't see any markers. It's a very busy main road. It's not a particularly nice part of Saint Quentin. So again, then we've got 1918, 21st of the 10th. So again, we're in October of 1918. French soldiers, but there's nothing personal about it, and I think I've kind of thought about this for a long time, because I've been visiting these kind of graveyards for a long time, and I think part of it is rooted. The why it's different from the British ones is almost rooted in the tragedy of the Pals Battalion. So for just a kind of bit of a reminder, a primer for those who don't know, the Pals Battalions was a uniquely British idea, whereby to aid in the war effort, they got men that worked together to fight together. So British towns, particularly northern British towns, people working in textile mills or coal mines or on farms, all came together and they served together. Leeds battalions, Newcastle battalions, Glasgow battalions, Manchester battalions, the Pals battalions. And of course, what meant that is that a lot of them on the 1st of July 1916 and the ensuing Battle of the Somme were killed. But what it does mean is you can go into a graveyard and you can visit and go, that's the Sheffield Pals Battalion, that's the Newcastle, that's the Leeds Pals Battalion. And it's really meant that from the 1920s onwards, those towns and cities have kind of adopted those cemeteries. That kind of makes sense, because there's such a high proportion of fellas from their hometown. So you've always had people going visiting, people know where their relatives are buried. So you've got that much more dynamic relationship between a British town and city and where people are buried. Whereas with the German graves, with the American graves, with the French ones, it's so much more mixed up. And I think that's the reason why you don't get this kind of adoption, if you like, do you know what I mean, of the cemeteries. But it makes me see Persian, obviously it was a World War, and Persians now modern day Iran. But it makes it very impersonal. There was a soldier yesterday from the Second War, so saying, don't know kind of what we fight for. I don't really what his point was. I'm not going to get into it. But you do have to wonder what the point of the First War was, particularly as now it's not really commemorated by most of the participants. The Second World War seems to have a bigger narrative, and it's possibly because it's an easier narrative. It's easier to establish who the goodies and the baddies are. You've got Hitler, you've got fascism, you've got the Holocaust, you've got all the ingredients that make it such a clear moral case as to why that had to be fought to the last man. There isn't that same moral case with the First World War. It was a war of empires where innocent young people, mostly men, but of course some women that were kind of serving, on both sides, which is why I've deliberately chose to finish this tour with footage from the German cemetery. I suspect that many of you will never have seen a German cemetery, and this holds 8,229 soldiers from the German. Interesting quote here: "Those who question Europe or despair about Europe should visit military cemeteries. They show what a disunited Europe and the confrontation of individual people who don't want to join or can't join attitudes must lead to." That was John called Dunker. My God, we need that idea now. Go and see these. If you believe, that belligerence, if falling out, if nations going against nations, if you think it's the answer, go to the war graves and go and see them. Now, roll this back on YouTube. You can kind of read what's kind of being said here. But this is about the treatment of the German graves, and obviously, for the Germans, there was a kind of a long period, particularly after the Second War, where the relationship with the French and the Germans was obviously pretty poor, well, very poor. And so it wasn't really until the 1960s, 1970s that the Germans were given proper burials. So this burial ground you're looking at here in Saint Quentin, which of course had been a German place, replaced the original kind of German cemetery. So these metal graves were put in the 1960s, the 1970s. And I thought I'd kind of show you these because I think it does illustrate and underline, particularly on this kind of day of remembrance, that there's the loss of life is on all sides. So we've got Karl Boneng there, a lieutenant in 1915. These are all men that didn't go back home to the families, to their children, to their wives, to their friends. It's too late for us now to start take moral judgments on the First World War. They just did what they were told, and as we know, when they got the chance, they ran across no man's land and played football. Now, get this to make you feel you're about to see the first German Jewish grave. So in the 1914-1918 war, Jewish soldiers fought against their German comrades. They were just Germans. Don't let anybody tell you that the First World War was about defeating fascism. It wasn't. And so you got Jewish servicemen fighting alongside their comrades, their countrymen. So I think if ever there's such a reminder of why the First World War and the Second World War is different, there is no goodies and baddies. There's just slaughter and loss and devastation. And then a relatively brief prelude, 20 years before it all starts all over again, because nothing was settled. The Germans were humbled, but they weren't really kind of beaten. They believed themselves to have been stabbed in the back. And of course, what happens when people become unhappy, unsettled with their national story? They find a scapegoat, and they find populist leaders that will tell them what they want to hear. And Hitler was nothing if not a populist leader that said it could have been different. You were stabbed in the back. If you'd have stuck with me. And Leslie's 17-year-old great uncle died on the 1st of July. No grave on Tietval. We'll visit Tietval on another tour. So what's interesting of this kind of cemetery is, as we're going to go and see now, the kind of temple which was built, is that, like so many of the memorials, there are classical allusions, in this case a Greek and a Roman soldier, a hoplite and a legionnaire. I think it's Greek and Roman. And I find it very interesting. You see these on memorials, you see them on British, on Canadian, now on German, on American, and I get it that they are kind of drawing parallels to the warrior cadre. I think that's deeply respectful, and I like it. But equally, it just seems that they're trying to give a sense of there was some purpose to the loss. There was nobility to it, and I don't know about that nobility. To me, it feels like death and sacrifice. That's why I think it's such a fascinating war, and we need to learn and understand it, because so many of the lives were lost for no good reason other than the fact of we were at war. So the Battle of Saint Quentin Canal was an overwhelming Allied success. The capture of this important location in Saint Quentin now. Provided a huge advantage. Imperial Germany had lost another defence line. And by 2nd of October, the British and Australian soldiers pushed on from Saint Quentin and punched a hole straight through the formidable Hindenburg line, which is why we've got so many losses here. So of those 8,000 troops, a good deal of them were lost over a few days here in Saint Quentin in September and October of 1918. So in morale terms, the Saint Quentin victory was seismic. German morale was approaching breaking point, but with the Canal Line in Allied hands, it was becoming clear to German High Command that the war was simply unwinnable. It won't be long now until the November the 11th Armistice, but there was still just over a month of tough, desperate fighting to come before the guns could fall silent on the Western Front. And as with any major Great War action, the capture of the Saint Quentin Canal resulted in mass casualties and deaths. You've seen quite a few now of the graves. British, Australian, American casualties. We think that they took about 10,000 killed and captured. US units took about 13,000 casualties. German figures, hard to pin down. And we know there's 8,000 here with 36,000 taken captive. And on November the 11th, 1918, a little over a month later, the Armistice ended hostilities and the guns fell silent on the 11th minute of the 11th hour of the 11th day, 11th month. And it all largely happened, began and finished here around Saint Quentin. So I hope that's given you some food for thought. I hope you've enjoyed the footage. If enjoy is the right word. I hope it's given you a sense of why I believe that Saint Quentin is a place of importance that I want to talk about and educate and help people to understand its significance. It was the place where the mobile war stopped, and it was a place where 3 years later it all started all over again. And in between times, of course, we had the First World War, the trenches, the mud, and everything else. But this was the mobile war, and this is thankfully the war that came to the end today in 1918. So thank you for joining me. Sorry about the hiccups along the way, and that, as they say, is that. So thank you for everybody who's joined me. Sorry about the hiccups. I'll try and edit those out as we go along. For those who watch it later, if you have left a contribution, thank you. I've been working on this all day, filming it over the summer, so I know some people think I was at home, but the time is just the same. So if you're able to, that's much appreciated. So thank you, everybody. Lovely to have you join us, and I look forward to speaking to you and seeing you very, very soon. Thank you, Susan. Yes, lest we forget. Rosemary's uncle is on the Menin Gate. If you go in and have a look at one of my videos from last year, a couple of years ago, I've got videos of the Menin Gate ceremony on there, Rosemary. So thank you, everybody, for joining me. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Linda, Sandy, everybody, Polly, Leslie, everybody who's joined me.